People obsess over the first million as if it were a finish line, a magical threshold where fear disappears and confidence becomes permanent. But I can tell you from the inside that the first million is not a victory lap. It is a confession, a brutal confirmation of what actually works and what was just noise all along. Early startups don't crack the code by brilliance alone. They stumble into it through pressure mistakes and moments where failure is so close that any illusion still clinging to the business is burned away. When I was chasing that first real traction, not revenue on paper, not vanity growth, but money that stayed money, that paid salaries without panic, I learned quickly that the market does not reward effort. It rewards alignment. And alignment only comes after you've been wrong enough times to stop arguing with reality. The first million is never about scaling. It is about survival, with proof about finding the narrow bridge between what customers say they want and what they will actually pay for when no one is watching. Most startups die before this point, not because they lack ideas, but because they confuse motion with progress, mistaking activity for validation, and burn themselves out chasing applause instead of cash flow. The untold truth is that early founders often resist the very moves that would get them to that first million, because those moves feel unglamorous, repetitive, even disappointing compared to the grand vision they sold themselves at the beginning. I've watched teams sabotage momentum by overbuilding, by polishing features no one asked for, by delaying pricing decisions out of fear of rejection when the market was waiting patiently to teach them a harsher lesson. The first million forces a kind of honesty that no mentor can teach because money has no politeness. It either shows up or it doesn't. And when it doesn't, every excuse you've been hiding behind collapses at once. Early startups that crack this stage do so by narrowing their focus to an almost uncomfortable degree, by choosing one customer type, one problem, one channel, and committing to it long enough to actually learn something real. This focus often feels like betrayal, like giving up potential, but potential does not pay rent, and early survival requires discipline more than imagination. I remember realizing that our breakthrough didn't come from a big pivot, but from finally saying no to 10 distractions. We had been calling opportunities, and that decision felt terrifying because it meant admitting that most of our work so far had been wrong. The first million is where founders learn that pricing is not a number. It is a signal, a declaration of who you are building for and how seriously you take your own value. And underpricing out of fear can be just as lethal as overpricing out of ego. Many early startups crack the code by discovering a simple truth, too late for others, that customers pay for relief, not features for certainty, not complexity, and that your job is to reduce friction, not impress them with how smart you are. The grind to that first million is monotonous, filled with sales calls that go nowhere, iterations that feel invisible, and small wins that no one celebrates. And this is where most people quit, not because it's impossible, but because it's boring and emotionally unrewarding. I've learned that boredom is often the last barrier before real traction, because once you know what works, repeating it feels beneath the ego that wanted innovation and novelty. Early startups that survive push through this discomfort building muscle memory around execution, refining, messaging, tightening operations, and learning to listen to weak signals before they become loud problems. The first million is also where relationships are tested, where co-founders argue over priorities, where early hires feel the strain of constant adjustment, and where leadership is revealed, not in speeches, but in consistency under stress. What history rarely tells you is how fragile this phase is, how one bad hire, one mispriced deal, one delayed decision can wipe out months of progress, and how the pressure of almost there can push founders into reckless choices. The startups that crack the code here develop an unusual respect for cash, not as a trophy, but as oxygen, and they learn to protect it fiercely while still investing enough to grow. I've seen founders hit that first million and feel nothing but exhaustion because the journey stripped away so much illusion that celebration felt premature. And in that exhaustion lies the real lesson that the first million doesn't make you safe. It makes you visible. Visibility attracts competitors, expectations, and complexity. And suddenly, the scrappy tactics that worked at $50,000 a month start to creak under their own weight. This is where the meaning of the first million becomes clear. It is not proof that you are special. It is proof that the market is willing to tolerate you for now, and that tolerance can vanish quickly if you stop paying attention. Early startups that truly crack the code treat this milestone not as an ending, but as feedback, as confirmation that a narrow set of behaviors should be doubled down on while everything else is questioned. The danger is mistaking momentum for inevitability, because nothing kills a young company faster than the belief that the hard part is over. I've learned that the first million is the point where the story splits, where one path leads to discipline clarity and sustainable growth, and the other leads to arrogance, sprawl, and slow decay. And it is right here, standing on that uncomfortable threshold, with proof in one hand and uncertainty in the other, that founders must decide whether they are willing to let go of who they thought they were building for how they thought success would feel and what they thought the journey would look like, because what comes next will demand a different level of maturity, a different relationship with risk, and a deeper understanding of what truly drives value. And that realization settles in quietly as the celebration fades and the numbers stabilize. And the sentence of this journey does not end here. It only pauses briefly right before the next phase begins, where the first million stops being a dream and starts becoming a test. And the real question shifts from whether you can make money at all to whether you can keep doing it without losing control of everything you just built. And that question hangs in the air as the story moves forward unfinished into what comes next, where the lessons of this milestone will be challenged immediately, and where the next decision you make will reveal whether cracking the code once was luck, or whether you are prepared to understand what it actually takes to do it again and again and again as the sentence continues, where the pressure subtly changes shape. Because after the first million, the question is no longer whether someone will pay, but whether they will keep paying as complexity increases and attention drifts. This is the phase where early startups either harden into real businesses or dissolve under the weight of their own momentum, because every shortcut taken on the way to that milestone now demands repayment with interest. I've lived this moment staring at revenue charts that looked healthy on the surface while feeling an unease underneath, because growth was exposing cracks in systems and culture in my own decision-making that had been easy to ignore when everything was about survival. The first million teaches you how to make money once. The next phase teaches you how to make it repeatable without burning everything else down. This is where founders must confront a difficult truth, that hustle is not a strategy and heroics do not scale, and the habits that felt virtuous in the early days can quietly become liabilities if they are not replaced with structure. Early startups that navigate this transition successfully do not chase the next million. With the same tactics, they slow down just enough to understand why the first one happened, documenting what worked, building guardrails, and investing in boring things like process support and clarity of roles. I remember the resistance inside me when we started formalizing things, because structure felt like surrender, like the end of the scrappy identity that had carried us so far. But refusing to grow up would have been the real betrayal. The untold story is that many startups hit a revenue milestone and immediately accelerate spending, mistaking cash for permission, when in reality, that cash is a test of restraint. The ones that crack the code long-term learn to protect their core before expanding outward, strengthening retention before chasing acquisition, and ensuring that each new dollar of growth does not introduce disproportionate risk. This is also where leadership must shift from doing to deciding, from solving every problem personally to designing systems that solve problems repeatedly. And that shift is uncomfortable because it forces founders to confront their own replaceability. I've seen teams fracture here, co-founders diverging on vision, early employees struggling to adapt to new expectations, and founders tempted to micromanage their way through uncertainty instead of trusting the structures they are trying to build. What separates those who move forward from those who stall is the willingness to endure short-term inefficiency in service of long-term stability, to accept that slowing down is sometimes the fastest way to sustain momentum. The first million also attracts noise advisors with opinions, investors with agendas, competitors with attention and filtering. This noise becomes a critical skill because not every suggestion is aligned with the narrow engine that created the initial success. Early startups that endure learn to protect focus almost aggressively, saying no, even when the opportunity looks flattering, because they understand that dilution is a quieter killer than failure. I've learned that at this stage, culture becomes strategy, because the values you tolerate under pressure will determine whether growth compounds or corrodes. Small compromises made for speed can calcify into norms that are painful to reverse, and the cost of correcting culture later is always higher than the cost of setting it early. This is where the meaning of the first million finally settles, not as proof of brilliance, but as evidence that you have found something worth protecting. And protection requires discipline, humility, and the patience to build for the long term while resisting the seduction of rapid expansion. The startups that truly cracked the code treat that initial success as a fragile signal, not a permanent entitlement, and they continue to listen to customers with the same intensity they did when nothing was guaranteed. Over time, if they get this right, growth becomes steadier, less dramatic, but far more durable, and the company begins to feel less like a bet and more like a responsibility. I've found that this is the moment when founders either reconnect with their original purpose or finally admit that the business has outgrown the story they started with, and both outcomes require courage. Because what comes next is no longer about proving that you can build something from nothing. It is about proving that you can steward what you've built without letting ego, fear, or impatience tear it apart. And that realization sits quietly in the background as the work continues, as the days become less chaotic but more demanding, and as the journey moves forward into a phase where success is measured not by spikes, but by resilience. If this story resonated with you, if you're standing at or approaching that first million and wondering why it doesn't feel like the end, then subscribe to the channel so we can keep talking honestly about what it takes to turn early traction into something that lasts, and leave a comment sharing what milestone changed the way you think about growth, because those reflections often hold the lessons we wish we had learned sooner.